Right. So I think it's 7 o'clock. Andrea, should we get started?
Absolutely. Great. Thank you, Ian. Alors, bonsoir à tous. Je m'appelle Andrea Smith et au nom des services aux familles des militaires, j'aimerais vous souhaiter la bienvenue au premier séminaire éducatif de ce soir sur le thème de renforcer la résilience grâce aux transitions éducatives. Donc, la présentation de ce soir aura lieu en anglais et cependant, veuillez noter que la fonction de sous-titres sur Zoom vous permettra d'accéder à la présentation en français. Et s'il vous plaît, soyez également à l'aise de poser vos questions en français pendant la période de questions et de réponses. Good evening, everyone. My name is Andrea Smith, and on behalf of Military Family Services, I would like to welcome you to tonight's first education seminar on the topic of building resilience through educational transitions. Our team developed the concept of offering education seminars based on direct feedback we receive in our work with our families. It's the distinct pleasure of our team to welcome Dr. Kim Hellemans as our guest speaker for this evening's presentation. Firstly, though, I would be remiss if I didn't introduce our newly launched education team who together work to develop educational tools, provide coaching, and work to mitigate the impact of relocation that it has on children of the CAF's education continuum. So tonight we have with us our coordinator, Jeremy, and my co-guidance counselor, Ian.
Hello, everyone.
Ian has been instrumental in the administration of this evening's presentation. So thank you, Ian, for your efforts in securing Dr. Hellemans as our first speaker to kick off our series of education seminars for CAF families. I'll ask Ian to do the honors of formally presenting our speaker and setting the stage for tonight's seminar. And with that, I would encourage families to look up and look at our website for up and coming seminars that we plan for the future. You'll also be able to find information on our website regarding freshly populated information pertaining to education across all 13 educational jurisdictions in Canada, as well as other resources for our CAF families who are on the move. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ian to do the formal introduction of our guest speaker this evening. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks, Andrea. Again, welcome, everyone. I'm going to run through a couple things really quickly before Kim gets started with her presentation. First of all, if you're sort of like us and this is a new undertaking working with Zoom, I just want to remind people of a couple of the features in the menu bar from left to right, the mute and stop video, which just means turn your camera off functions. And I see everyone's doing really well with that, so that's perfect. The chat function will be available and you're welcome to enter your questions there. And then you'll also have access to a live translation or transcript. So if you click on the closed captioning button, you'll be able to choose the language in which you would like to read the captions. So if your preferred language is French, then you can see the subtitled presentation in French. And then on the far right, when it comes time to say goodbye, the end button is how you would click, what you would click to leave the meeting. Just move on to the next slide here. Here we go. So just really quickly, here's our agenda for tonight. Just to cover a couple of things around the meeting. As I mentioned, the microphones are off, chat is available, and a reminder that we choose to keep this as a safe and respectful environment. Important to say at the beginning, and I know that some of the topics that we talk about can be difficult for families, but that's the guideline that we like to work around. And then we'll have a presentation from Dr. Hellemans, at the end of which there'll be an opportunity to answer questions. So those could be entered in the chat. You can raise your electronic hand. And if you don't feel comfortable asking your particular question in this medium, then you're welcome to share those questions with us afterwards. Our intention is to edit out the question and answer portion of the recording, but then share any relevant responses through the website, and then we'll wrap up at the end of the evening. Really excited tonight to have Kim here with us to share some of her experience and expertise around building resilience through educational transitions. Kim is a neuroscience professor, educator at Carleton University and the Associate Dean of Science. Her work focuses on how current life stressors relate to mental health and academic outcomes for university-age students. She also has the added benefit of being a military child herself, so her lived experience is also incredibly valuable on this topic. If you're interested, you can also catch Kim on her podcast, Minding the Brain, and I'm sure she'll plug that at some point in the presentation, I hope. So I'm going to stop sharing here really quickly, and if you can just give us a minute, Kim will be able to pull up her screen and share with us her presentation.
Thank you, Ian and Andrea and Jeremy. Thank you for that warm welcome. Bonjour tout le monde. Ça m'a fait vraiment plaisir d'être avec vous ce soir. I'll be doing my talk in English, but I'm happy to take questions in French, et peut-être je peux les répondre en français, peut-être. But just a quick question. Wondering, do you see in my
I do.
presenter, or is it my presenter mode?
I see your slideshow. It looks good.
Okay, so you don't see my notes or anything?
No. I see. Nope, just next slide. I do see the notes at the bottom underneath the. Okay, so yeah, I do see those.
I need to do this.
Okay.
And how about now? It should be.
That's it.
Yeah,
that's got it.
Okay, it just depends on what screen I'm sharing to. Anyway, so without further ado, I'll get started. And like I said, welcome in everybody. I'm glad to see you're joining me today. My talk is Building Academic Resilience to Support Educational Transitions. And before I get started, I want to acknowledge that I currently work, live, and play on the unceded territories of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. We know this now as Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. So if you feel comfortable doing so, you can pop in the chat where you're located. If you want to know what traditional territory you live on, you can go to nativeland.ca and you can find out where you're currently residing. But I'd love to hear, I'm hearing from all over Canada, potentially elsewhere. So happy to find out where everybody's joining us today. So as Ian mentioned, I am a military child. So pictured here on the slide, this is my father, retired Lieutenant Colonel Lucas Hellemans. He retired, my goodness, I should have looked this up beforehand, I believe in 1999, just as I was heading off to university. But he retired, he now lives in both my parents live in Ottawa. And I'm just going to sketch out a little bit of my background. I don't want to take too much time talking about this, but I think it is relevant to speak about my own experiences. So I was actually born in Ottawa, but moved 6 months later to London, Ontario. And this is a picture of my sister and I. So we're 1 year apart. My sister is a year older than I am. In London, Ontario, I was probably around 2. My sister is 3. So we lived in London for a couple of years before we moved to St. Bruno, Quebec, and we were there for 3 years. And then here's us pictured in front of this giant moving truck because our next post was going to be overseas. So my dad got posted to England, where he'd actually previously been posted prior to my sister and I being born. He actually met my mom in Germany. So they were in Germany, then England, then Canada, had us. So we moved off to England. I found this picture in the archives. This is my sister and I's passport photos from 1981. And pictured here as well is our PMQ. So the actual living, we typically did live off base, except for when we were in foreign countries. So when we were in England, this was actually the military housing. And it was a beautiful house located right next to a forest. Couldn't ask for more growing up as a kid living wild. Although my sister and I did complain, not another castle, mummy, when we were forced to head off and sightsee on our weekends. So we lived in England for 4 years, and then we moved back back to Canada. And I took this picture. I thought some of you might get a giggle out of this. Always invariably, the packing was an issue. This was all my sister and I's Barbie stuff that were just kind of dumped into a box, and we always had an interesting challenge of sorting through the things that had been packed by the military packers. Often we would have a lot of broken objects. But we moved back to Canada in 1984, and about 6 months later, I don't know if any of you are old enough, maybe not, we actually, Barrie experienced Canada's worst national disaster. We had a Category 5 tornado in May of 1985, actually the May 31st, so the anniversary of that is coming up. And I bring this up because, I want to, we're talking about resilience, we're talking about stress. I would characterize this as a trauma, although I didn't know it at the time as a child that this was what I was going through. But here we are, a new family. We had just moved to a new city 6 months prior, and this mass devastation that had occurred. My entire school, all the portables ended up in Lake Simcoe. Our school had to get shut down. We finished off our academic year at Georgian College. And so, it was a pretty harrowing time for the family. And not 6 months later, we were posted again. My dad did a stage at the Armed Forces Military College in Virginia, in Norfolk. So the last picture there is us standing in front of the PMQ right on the Army base. And that was just a wild, wild experience. Once again, we had a severe hurricane go through at the time, which was, again, another very challenging experience. My sister and I were in a school that was considered inner city, and we experienced what I would say is the first time being a white individual living in going to school, which was 65-75% racialized. So white folks were the minority. And that was definitely an experience that I had never had before. Very important experience for sure to be existing in that space. So I won't go on and talk about the rest of my moves. I wanted to kind of give you a bit of a snapshot of life, what it was for me in moving every 2-3 years. You can see here 3 different countries. I'm not sure if you or your families have experienced the same so far. But I wanted to contextualize this before we move into really the more educational piece of my talk. And talking about stress, coping, and mental health, because I wanted you to know that I have this lived experience. And I'll come back to this at the end of my talk. So I'm going to frame my talk in the context of what I know, which is around mental health. And I promise you I will come back to the space of resilience and what this means for military families. I promise I'll have that narrative and that thread throughout my talk today. But I want to frame this around mental health because mental stress and mental health it's very much interlaced, and I'm going to talk about it in the context of student mental health because that's the data I know, and I will again revert back to how that relates to the military experience throughout my talk. So we've known for a long time that student mental health is in a crisis, right? So it's not just youth, and that's what we would consider youth are young children, 10, 11, 12, all the way up to 17, 18-ish, are experiencing a mental health crisis. But the population that I study would be considered emerging adults or young adults that are not only emerging adults, so we would say that's 18 to 28, 29 even, but that's where the category that I study, which is university students, and university students fall under that emerging adult developmental period. And this is a vulnerable period as well. Like young youth are vulnerable, as are these emerging adults. And why that is because of, first of all, their stage of development in the brain. Pictured here on the slide is a very famous image from Jay Geed in New York, who was one of the first to show with, advanced imaging technique. This is the same individual that's been scanned across development from 5 to 20, and you don't need to be a neuroscientist to see the colors are changing. And the colors are changing because the cell populations are changing, and not only the cell populations are changing, but the connections between those cells change all throughout our childhood, all the way up until early adulthood. So all that is to say that even university students, they really still are children, I would say, and they're still at a stage in their life where their brain is developing and sensitive to stressors and inputs. At the same time, emerging adults are considered a vulnerable population because of the unique stressors that they're facing and the experiences that they're going through in terms of figuring out their identity, their relationships, identity, their relationships. They're also becoming more socially aware citizens. They're doing social activism at that time. And so all these factors kind of roll into why it is that university students are this vulnerable population. And what does that mean in terms of statistics? How are university students showing us that they're not well? Well, when you look at the World Mental Health surveys, the data are pretty clear. 1 in 3 students, so these are university students across the world, have a diagnosed mental health or substance use disorder. In addition, when you look at the Canadian context, this is a pre-COVID data, but it's very close, it's 2019. What that data shows us from the Canadian context is about 50% of Canadian students felt so depressed it was difficult to function, and close to 70% felt overwhelming anxiety. And most concerning, about little less than 20% of Canadian students report seriously considering suicide in the past 12 months. These data are worrisome. These are pre-COVID data. I have a whole host of data that I have from before COVID. I'm not going to show it today. I want to talk a little bit about COVID, and I'm sure if you are individuals who have young children, you would have experienced the impact of the pandemic on not only your well-being, but the well-being of your children. And we can look at the pandemic as sort of a timeline of stress, right? Where we had that initial response to the pandemic. I don't know if you remember where you were. March 2020, I was the chair of the Department of Neuroscience. I was called into the dean's office where we had all the meetings of all the chairs and directors in science. And I remember my dean saying, everything's shutting down. Everything is shutting down. How, we're going to have to figure out how to keep our classes going. We're going to have to figure out how to keep our labs going, because we, like me as a scientist, we have wet labs. We have graduate students literally working with animals. How could we do that when we were supposed to be socially isolating or socially distancing? So how do we keep our academic and research programs alive throughout this period where we didn't know how long it was going to last, but the university was going to shut down? And I remember being in the dean's boardroom and my heart rate was about 135 beats per minute, sitting down thinking, I just want to go home. I want to pick up my kids from school. So my kids are 12 and 9. They were 6 and 9 when the pandemic struck. So they're fairly young kids. I just wanted to go home, close down all the doors and shut out from society, right? So I remember, I'm sure you all kind of, this resonates with you. So we have that initial response, and you can imagine for folks that are at risk for vulnerabilities associated with mental health, this would have been a big triggering factor. And now, again, I'm not going to show you so much of the data, but I can tell you now we are seeing these massive rippling or outcomes of the pandemic on vulnerable folks as a result of this stressful experiences. And then of course that long period, I'm not sure if any of you were in Canada at the time or in Ontario even, where we had school closures, university continued to be shut down. We didn't have a full return to campus until this past fall. So what that meant was a loss of social networks, a loss of peer supports, and developmental psychologists, people like myself, neuroscientists, were kind of looking at this and going, this is going to have an impact on our society. And then, of course, we had that long period from 2021, 2022, and beyond. Even now, we can say that things have changed, right? And even at Carleton, we now offer more of our classes online. We have learned about the importance of inclusivity, accessibility, and what that means for some of our students who did thrived, not all of them, but some thrived with the remote learning experiences, whereas some of them really, really struggled. So navigating that space to the changes in our structures has been very much an interesting experience. So I was studying student mental health before the pandemic. I was very keen and aware of how my students would be impacted by the initial shutdown of the university, and I was listening to students. So here are, you know, some of the quotes that I was surveying my students anonymously. I was checking in with them. You know, you can read here several of the comments that my students were telling me. Their mental health had taken a toll, their productivity had been low, their experiences of loneliness. I very tragically had one of my students die by suicide 2 weeks after the pandemic struck. It was awful. As somebody, she was in my class, she was in my program. I really grieved that. I wondered, what could I have done differently? How could I have reached out and supported her? And her best friend did acknowledge that a lot of what was leading up to it was the stress and the loneliness of the pandemic. And then we saw and heard our students that were coping sometimes maladaptively. So they were coping by playing video games, not maladaptive, but going for walks and getting high. So a lot of substance use. I've got a whole research arm that looks at cannabis use on campus, as well as problematic social media use. So I've got a lot of research that explores that as a result of the pandemic. But ultimately, we were hearing the students were not doing well. And so my colleagues and I, we were very lucky. We were successful in getting a grant from Carleton to explore the impact of the pandemic systematically on our students. So we designed new scales to explore exactly that. To what extent has the COVID pandemic negatively impacted things like finances, mental health, stress levels, and so on. And so we did publish these findings. I'm not going to spend I don't want this to be too much of a data-driven talk, but this is a snapshot from our paper. I'm not sure if any of you know anything about academics. Publications are sort of the bread and butter of what we do as scientists. If you publish a paper, within a year, maybe you'll have 3 citations. So your citation index is how successful is that paper? People are citing it, people are reading it, right? So it's having impact. So the average is, you get 3 to 5 citations in 1 year. This one has had 120 citations. So we were one of the first to publish the impact of the pandemic on university student mental health and well-being. And I'm not going to, again, talk too much about the actual data. But what you're seeing here are gender differences. So I want to acknowledge we're only looking at male and female data here. We do ask about gender identity beyond the binary. So we ask about gender identities, gender diverse, gender nonconforming, etc. But too few students who identify outside of male and female participate in our studies, so we can't do meaningful statistics on them. So we have to unfortunately exclude them from analysis. But suffice it to say, what we do see, females are the open bars, males are the filled bars, and we're asking questions like, how I'm just turning off here. How difficult has the transition to online learning been for you? Easy, neutral, difficult. To what extent has the pandemic impacted your schoolwork? Not at all, to very much or extreme amount. So how has it impacted your social isolation, your social relationships, stress levels, and mental health? And what you can see from the data we had a significant gendered impact. So more females were telling us that the impact of the pandemic was greater on stress and measures of stress and mental health and learning relative to males. So that was one of the major findings. And then I've since followed that up with a number of other papers that I'm currently writing up for publication, that we also saw that females were engaging in problematic social media use more so than males, whereas males were coping by gaming, and they were also, to a small extent, using cannabis more than females, and this was mapping on negatively onto their academics. So that's a little bit of the snapshot of the pandemic. Tiny one. So where have I been so far? I've talked about mental health being a challenge, particularly among university students. There's scholars that have looked at this among youth, so children that are my kids' age, school-age children. We do see that there is a youth mental health crisis, and we also see that the pandemic has impacted youth mental health. My colleague Tracy Vaillancourt, who's at the University of Ottawa, has published a lot on this in particular, seeing that, again, stress and anxiety levels are higher. And it's not that we have people who were already stressed or anxious or experiencing mental health challenges. They didn't get worse. It was that people who didn't have any mental health challenges, suddenly they were coming out of the woodwork. And we think that this is because people who already had existing challenges were probably already connected to services and supports that they could link into during the pandemic. And then we see this potentially other vulnerable population that is unmasking some of the challenges around mental health. And then we had yet another transition. I mentioned Carleton didn't go back to full in-person learning until this past fall. And so we were anticipating some additional challenges. We had fully 3 cohorts, 3 years of students that were landing on our campuses for the first time. We had our first year students coming. We had our second and third year students that had missed out on that key fall, orientation because of the campus closures. So we sort of figured we were going to see some of the challenges associated with this, particularly with students returning to in-person learning and in-person exams. And sure enough, after a year, we are reflecting on this in my role as Associate Dean and also in my research. We are seeing some challenges associated with return to in-person learning. And I'm hearing this because I talk a lot with my colleagues that are teaching high school, so secondary, that this is also what they're seeing in secondary aged youth. Increased social anxiety is a big one. So we had a lot of students that were learning from home, and some thrived in that environment, some did not. And there are definitely some that felt more at ease learning from home because they already probably had underlying social anxiety issues, that then when you've missed out on 2-3 years of normal peer-to-peer interaction, then suddenly being placed into these very large discomforting situations that are new, particularly in university, can be really, really challenging. And like I said, we see this, I'm hearing it from high schools a lot, and then also in university. We do have students that are reluctant to come back to campus and are finding it really, really challenging to be in spaces with lots of people they don't know anymore, or they don't know. And I'm saying, does this sound familiar, right? When we think about all the moves that we've had, when I think about my experiences as a child in the military, I was consistently being placed in situations where I didn't know anybody, and I was having to relearn cultures and customs, and sometimes language, and sometimes even the curriculum, right? I remember being in the US, and my teacher called my mom and said, Kim doesn't know the Pledge of Allegiance. And my mom was like, well, she's Canadian. She's not meant to know the Pledge of Allegiance. But they, often I would have teachers saying, your child doesn't know how to do this. Your child doesn't have this kind of skill set, because the curriculum that had been prior hadn't taught something yet. So all these challenges can be uncomfortable, and for some folks, this can be, that are vulnerable, this can map out into increased social anxiety. Related, we're also seeing this coming through as challenges with group work. So in university situations, less so, maybe a little bit in high school, and it depends on the program. You have to learn how to work with others, and this is very much the case with my colleagues in engineering or Sprott School of Business. A lot of the skills that you develop throughout your university career and a lot of the degree level outcomes are around working in partnership. And because we are seeing this global cognitive delay of the pandemic, we are noticing that students haven't had those opportunities to kind of experience challenging interpersonal circumstances, right? So that's like part of like normal cognitive development, is just figuring out, like, I don't agree with you. and saying that in a way that isn't escalating, right? And like trying to assert yourself into those kinds of group contexts. And we are seeing that among our university students, they don't know how to confront, and they don't know how to work with each other in a way that isn't going to lead to escalation or people's hurt feelings. They don't know how to cope with that. We're also seeing challenges with metacognition. What does that mean? Metacognition is thinking about thinking. So how this translates into the academic or learning context, to have good metacognition is, and I'm going to speak very bluntly here, it's knowing what you are capable of and what you're not capable of. Knowing, if I'm presented with a calculus problem and I'm asked, do you know how to solve this? I'm aware of my own limitations, so I can say, yes, I could know how to solve this. And then you're presented with the solution. You're like, yes, okay, that's how I would have done it. That's metacognitive capabilities. And we are seeing a massive decrease in this among our students, in that they're not aware of what they're not aware of. Does that make sense? And so this is playing out in curious ways, and primarily the outcome of that is we're seeing lots of lower grades, because this also impacts how you study, right? So if you don't know what you don't know what you should be studying in order to acquire that ability. And we think that this is due to 2-3 years of passive learning. When students were primarily learning online, and this is even in high school age students, even our university students that spent their first 2 years learning virtually, they're doing what you're doing right now, which is totally fine. There's not going to be an exam after the end of today's talk, but you're passively listening. You're not engaging with me. If I was with you in a room, I would be looking at the whites of your eyes. You wouldn't be maybe scrolling on your phone as a distraction technique, which admittedly all of us do. I've done it as well in some talks. But students in particular, if sitting at home learning from their screen, is very hard to sustain attention for that long. And because that involves hardware in your brain that are involved in that executive control and functioning, not having that practice has had these, I think, consequences in reduced metacognition. And then finally, one other thing that we're observing, and this is also, I'm hearing this from my colleagues that are teaching elementary and high school, is reduced distress tolerance. What this maps out like is students not being able to manage small stressors in their life that normally they could sort of ride the wave and not kind of catastrophize. What we're seeing is like students having 1-2 punch, I've got this assignment due and this assignment due, and they go up here and end up in severe distress, as opposed to kind of like being able to sort of talk themselves through that space. And I will return to this at the end of my talk, talking about some strategies for coping with this. But ultimately, how this is panning out is students having difficulties with time management and being able to manage, again, those multiple stressors. So where have I taken you? Taking you to provide some kind of snapshot on student mental health pre and post COVID. We're all here because we have families, no matter how young they are. They may not have been impacted by the pandemic. I'm not sure if they're school aged or maybe you have toddlers, but ultimately the pandemic did impact all of us because it was a stressor. So this becomes, the next question is, well, what can we do? Right? What can we do given that we are in that sort of third phase of the pandemic, which is the rippling of the impact of this in terms of health, right? So we also, we can talk about long COVID as being one of those echo pandemics out of the COVID pandemic, but I would say mental health is another echo pandemic. And you as military families, this is yet another piece, right? So maybe you've moved around throughout COVID and you've had to experience being in, physical distancing while you're in a new country, and that's like an additional stressor. But now your children and you yourselves are managing this space, and now adding in those layers of moving around and having to manage your mental health and well-being, given that these moves are a stressor. So I want to take a moment and ask you a question, and hopefully this works. I'm going to pop up what's called it's a poll everywhere. It's a poll, and it's anonymous. I have no idea who's filling it in, and it's just to gauge your thoughts on this. So hopefully this works. So what you can do if you have a cell phone, it's probably easiest actually if you go onto your web browser, you open up a new web browser and type in pollev.com/my name, KIMHELLEMANS, so 2 E's, 2 L's, 1 M, 1 N. It should pop up and you should be able to click on the answer. Alternatively, there's a QR code. I think that should work. Or you can send a text to 37607, text my name, and then the response. So I just want you to tell me, is stress bad for the body? Do you strongly agree, neither agree nor disagree, or strongly disagree? So if somebody can tell me, maybe from the MFS team, if it's working for you, that would be grand.
Yep, worked for me.
Perfect.
Yeah, I put it in the browser and it seemed to work.
Okay, and then I'm just looking at the chat now. Karen's joining from Ottawa. Welcome. And Natasha's saying a story about Packers packed a full ashtray when we moved from Germany. Oh my God, that's hilarious. Yeah. And then Dina is joining from Halifax. How cool. So you're ahead of us. Okay. Is anybody still polling in? If you want to just raise your hand and pop something in the chat to let me know if you are still polling in. Otherwise, this should work. Okay, so we've got, I would say, the great majority are agreeing or strongly agreeing with the statement stress is bad for the body. And I'm here to tell you that I led you down the garden path. And every time I do some variation of this talk, it's exactly the same distribution that I see. Most people agree with that statement. Stress is bad for the body. And it's no surprise because we get a lot of media that tells us this, right? We get a lot of comments in the news that say stress is terrible, right? How to control our stress. What I just did was just present to you a case that basically showed stress and mental health, right? Stress and mental health, the pandemic, stress exacerbated mental health. But the reality is the correct answer is neither. It depends. It's neither agree nor disagree. It really does depend on a whole bunch of things. And that's what the next half of my talk is going to be about, is reframing stress. So the truth is, how we face and cope with stressors has a huge impact on our mental health and well-being. And as the grandfather or father of stress research, Hans Selye, wrote, it's not the stress that kills us. It is our reaction to it. So it's not necessarily stress that's bad for the body. It's the reaction to the stressor. So whether we mount that massive stress response and what that means, that's ultimately what can have drastic, devastating consequences. And pictured here on the slide, it shows this, right? That if you look at along the y-axis here, or x-axis here, too little stress is not good, right? Impaired attention, you're bored, you're apathetic. So when I teach lectures on stress, most students are shocked to discover this, that there's too little stress is not good. Yeah, actually, stress is a motivator. Stress alerts the organism. So I do a whole lecture on the neurobiology of stress. What is the purpose of stress? Stress is there so that you can pay attention and focus on approaching things that are important for your survival and avoiding things that threaten your survival. When you're hungry, you're stressed, that motivates the organism to go out and seek food. If you weren't stressed about not being hungry, you would die. And then in the middle, so if we're looking at like how, looking at this as the behavioral outcome of how much stress is present, we want to be in this zone, right? The middle place where you're being stimulated, you're motivated, and we would call this eustress from the Greek euphoria, happiness, joy. It is possible to experience stressful states as positive and good and beneficial. So here in that state, you can see the impact on behavior is optimal. It's an inverted U. Too little stress is not good, and too much stress is not good either. When you have optimal experiences of stress, it focuses you, you have emotional balance, you have good thinking. And what we're all thinking is that we're always here, right? In this too much stress is bad, right? And it is true. Like when you're experiencing very high stress levels, this does very much impact your physiology and ultimately then your cognition, your emotion, and your behavior. And this is where we don't want to be. We want to avoid that distress zone, either too little or too much stress. It's like Goldilocks and the Three Bears, right? Too hot, too cold, just right. And then of course, this begs the question, how do we do that? How do we code stress as positive stress? Because wouldn't that be great if we could all do that all the time? And here's a sort of pathway by which this happens. And importantly, in stress research, we talk about stress, and we talk about stress appraisal, and then we talk about coping. So what does that mean by appraisal? Well, so importantly, every event or situation that you undergo goes through a process of cognitive appraisal. So let's imagine, I always give student examples just where I am. Imagine you have a paper due next week. Okay, so you go through a period of cognitive appraisal. That first cognitive appraisal, you're like, oh, is this something that's a threat? Is this something that is going to stress? Like you think of it as a stressor, right? More often than not with students, like writing a paper, that's a perceived threat. I have work to do. Very occasionally though, if you've got like a short quiz and you feel confident about the material tomorrow, you're like, no big deal, no threat is perceived. This actually does not elicit a stress response. So that does occasionally happen, right? Another example is giving a talk, right? I regularly stand up and talk in front of audiences of 600 people at times. I give a podcast, I talk on the radio. To me, public speaking is not a threat. So I don't mount a stress response. I don't know what my resting heart rate is right now, but it's not very high, right? I'm probably in like 95. For other people, talking in front of an audience is extremely stressful. So this would be appraised as a threat. And then if we perceive it as a threat, then this is important. We go through that second appraisal where we don't necessarily do this like, do I have the ability to code? And we're not like thinking about this in conscious ways, but your brain, your mind does do this, is we go through that period of can I cope, right? So let's go back to that paper, right? So you've perceived it as a threat. Oh no, I have a paper due next week. Maybe you're like, I've had a great week of sleep. I've been to class. I've read all my notes. I've done some background research already. I feel good about this. I feel like I can write this paper. That perceived ability to cope is what leads to positive stress. However, if we have the other thing that happens, which happens more often than not in some of my students, oh my God, I just looked at this deadline yesterday. I've got all these other things to do. Plus I'm working at my part-time job and I'm volunteering here. And how am I going to have time to write this paper? Oh my goodness, right? Perceived inability to cope. That's when it's coded as a negative stressor. And that's what mounts that massive stress response, where it is a different flood of catecholamines, things like dopamine, endorphins, cortisol, which is your main stress hormone, that pumps your body into saying, okay, we need to actually have a fight or flight response here. Versus positive stress, it's a very different qualitative and quantitative experience. So hopefully you've now become aware that not all stressors, so the stressor is the external internal event that causes or leads to a stress response, not all stressors lead to stress, And not all stressors lead to negative stress. And of course, maybe you're wondering, well, how do you boost this, right? This is the magic question. How can you boost your ability to cope with stress? Because remember what Hans Selye said, it's not the stress that kills you, it's your reaction to it. So how can we improve our ability to react or cope with stress? And here's where I want you to situate yourselves and your children and think about your experiences as families in transition, learning new languages, learning new cultures, new curricula, making new friends. My God, that is the most stressful thing as a kid, to be pulled from your friend groups. And oh, here we go again, got to make new friends, right? I remember that as I aged more, thinking like, what's the point? What's the purpose of making friends? I'm just gonna have to leave them in 2 years, right? So how can you boost your ability to cope with stress? And now I'm going to talk about the 4 pillars of good mental and physical health. And I say that, and I say good pillars of health because mental health is health, but some people need to be reminded of that sometimes. And these are lifestyle factors that are scientifically proven, evidence-based, that these boost your ability to cope with stress because they boost your brain function. And I want to remind everybody, not everyone has a degree in neuroscience and not everybody thinks about this so obviously like I do. Your brain is an organ. It's the organ of your mind. And just like all the other organs of your body, it requires good being taken care of in order to function well. And this often means things like sleep, diet, exercise, and social connection. So I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about each of these pillars and what the neuroscience says for the evidence on why this is good and healthy. And I encourage you to reflect on how maybe you've heard all these things before, right? Why it's important. Well, you've probably heard about it in the context of physical health and not necessarily in the context of mental health. So let's first talk about sleep. So if you want to, feel free to write in the chat how many hours sleep you got last night or not. I can tell you I got 8 hours because I am fairly regimented, haha, army joke, with my sleep habits. I tend to go to sleep at the very, very similar time of night and wake up similar time in the morning. I actually did a whole thing for Carleton University, just pumped out a whole social media thing on me giving 3 tips for healthy sleep. But the reason why sleep is important, like scientists don't really know what's the purpose of sleep, but we do know the impact of when you don't sleep well. Oh, we got 4 hours, 3 to 5. Oh my goodness. Okay. 7.5, 7, 5. Okay. So we got an average here about 5 hours. I'm doing my math in my head. That's not very much. So why sleep is important is because it gives your brain a break. And one of the other things that neuroscientists have recently discovered is that there is a system in our brain known as the glymphatic system. And you might have heard of the lymphatic system. It's connected to the immune system, and it's involved in like draining fluids from the body to some extent. So, you know, when or your lymph nodes, when they're inflamed, it's often a sign of infection. So there's like all the white cells gather there, and then they're drained out of the body. There are cells in the brain that are connected to these lymph cells, and what scientists have discovered is that the role of the glymphatic system is to remove the misfolded proteins, all the errors involved in cell replication from the brain to be sort of taken out as waste products. And this is really important because the accumulation of too many misfolded proteins in the brain is associated with things like Alzheimer's disease or other dementias. And the glymphatic system is most active at night. And if you're not getting enough rest, again, this is all big epidemiological data. There's not a lot of causal here, so take that with a grain of salt, but it's correlational data. Scientists have shown that people who don't get regular amounts of sleep, this can put them at risk for later cognitive decline. So things like dementias, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's. And they think perhaps because of this lack of the ability to appropriately remove the brain's waste products. So that's one neuroscience reason why we should probably get a good night's sleep. You're allowing your brain that period of rest and recovery and allowing for repair of your nervous system as you're resting and sleeping. The other pillar is diet. I don't want to spend too much time on that because it's a sticky space, diet, because there's so many other variables that can impact diet. But increasingly, what we're recognizing is that diets that are you have more processed food intake as opposed to what I would say is real food. High processed food diets lead to high levels of inflammation in the body. And we know that high levels of inflammatory factors that circulate all throughout the bloodstream can get up into the brain and increase inflammation in the brain. And there's now increasing links between high levels of like a high inflammatory diet and mental health. And one of my close colleagues at the University of Ottawa, Marie-Claude Audet, her whole research area is exploring this with diet, the microbiome, so your gut, that healthy bacteria in your gut that can get disrupted again with various different diets, then can also promote anxiety. And she's also showing that some of this can be tempered if we have diets that are high in prebiotics and probiotics. So once again, it's a curious space to think that diet can impact not only your physical health, but also can impact your mental health. The third pillar is exercise. Once again, that's something we tend to think exercise, of course, it's healthy for us. It helps our heart, it grows our muscle. But exercise is also very important for our mental health. And scientists are increasingly recognizing that people who engage in 150 minutes or more of moderate aerobic exercise. So that's exercise that gets you at 60 to 70% of your max heart rate. You know, as an example, if you're going for a run, you shouldn't really be able to hold a conversation with somebody as you're out there exercising. If you're spending that time doing that aerobic exercise throughout a week, that is associated with, once again, less incidence of cognitive problems throughout your lifetime, and also is associated with lower mental health symptoms, so depression and anxiety. And scientists think the mechanism for this is because when you're exercising, you're promoting a lot of blood flow up to your brain. Your brain is a greedy organ. It wants to get a lot of that blood flow because it's hungry. It wants glucose. It wants oxygen. So when your heart rate is up, you're pumping your brain full of glucose and oxygen, increasing your input uptake of these things, and at the same time then nourishing your brain cells. Because one of the other things that scientists have found is that high levels of aerobic exercise is correlated with increased production of key proteins that are involved in literally building the cells of the brain. So things like brain-derived neurotrophic factor, nerve growth factor, vesicular endothelial growth factor, which is what grows your blood vessels or the cells that line your blood vessels. These are all increased when you're exercising. And so scientists think you're promoting good brain health, which again, you're promoting your brain, the organ of your mind. So when your brain is healthy, your mind is healthy. So this also very much boosts our ability to cope with stress. And I'm going to show you some data a little later on this because it's really, really cool data. The last thing, the last pillar I would say is social connections. Scientists have long known this massive paper came out a few decades ago. It was a massive epidemiological paper across many different countries across the world that showed when they looked at what predicted mortality and morbidity. So whether you died earlier than what your country would predict, and then morbidity, how sick you are. What is the best predictor of that is not things like you would think like smoking or sedentary behavior, so you're not exercising. It's actually the quality of your social connections. So people who said that they could identify strong social support were more likely to live longer than what their the actuarial science would predict based on where you live. And this makes sense as somebody, I would consider myself a social neuroscientist, that when you think about how humans have evolved throughout development and throughout a period of evolution, we evolved to live in social groups. We would not have survived, our ancestors would not have survived had we been living alone. We needed to rely on our social group in order to have somebody that would go out and seek food while the other kept shelter, and also raise children, and also eventually, like, we had crop development and so on and so forth. So the brain actually perceives social isolation as a threat. And so good, healthy social connections are vital for normal brain functioning, and again, at the root of healthy response to stress. And we can all think about it in ourselves. If we can identify somebody that we could call or rely on in periods of stress, that eases our conscience, right? If we know we have that 3 a.m. friend, that, and it could be a family member, right? That's a pretty awesome feeling to have. So all these lifestyle factors are important in boosting our ability to cope with stress. And I want to briefly talk about coping, because scientists have categorized different coping strategies into different groups. And so when we think about how we cope with stress, so if I were to ask you, like, what is your way to cope with stress, you can even put it in the chat if you want. Some of us might say, I go for a run. Some might say, I call a friend. Some might cry. Some might drink alcohol. Each of these would be considered a form of coping. And scientists have kind of grouped them into these main themes. So avoidance coping, right, is one of the themes where we run away from stress. Humor is considered avoidant coping. So is substance use, for example. There's also problem solving, right? Like if you're if your kid is sick, right, and you got to figure out, or like, what are you going to do when you have a big thing at work and you got to go to work? Problem solving would be like, okay, who can I call? How am I going to manage this having my kid at home? Another type of coping is emotion-focused coping. So that's anger, sadness, right? So we all know somebody who like blows up whenever they're stressed, and can yell at others, or they self-blame, right? So they take it out on themselves. That would be considered emotion-focused coping. And then there's like spirituality for those that have faith. That is considered a form of coping, to turn to God or Christ or Buddha or Muhammad. These are considered ways to cope as well. And then finally, it's like social support is its own category of coping. And probably as you're hearing all this, you're thinking, well, some of them are good and some of them are bad. And that's normal. A lot of us tend to think like, well, drinking alcohol is a bad thing. Crying is a bad thing, potentially. But I'm here to tell you that what scientists have shown is it's not the type of coping that we engage in when we experience stress that is important. It's in fact your flexibility with coping strategies. So when you're able to kind of deploy one type of a coping strategy and then recognize that that's not working and use another kind of coping strategy to help you navigate that stressor. So being flexible with your coping strategies is ultimately what is really the most important factor in managing how you react to stress. So I've talked about how stress is not inherently bad. It can be good. I've talked about how you can experience positive stress or eustress, and how we get into that positive stress really depends on that cognitive appraisal process where we engage certain coping strategies, our perceived ability to cope. I've talked about how you can boost your coping and what that means to engage with probably different types of flexibility of coping strategies. And all of this is really, it's all about boosting your resilience. So at the end of the day, when we talk about boosting your ability to cope with stress, what we're really saying is your resilience. And when we think about the context of moving and taking your child from a school board and telling them, okay, we're, mommy or daddy's been posted, and we're going to move again, having those conversations. I don't really actually remember any of them when I reflect on it. I think, as a child of the military, because you grow up with it, you just kind of assume it's going to happen. You always know that a move is eventual. But when we think about what it takes to get through that, and to be able to power through, and like I can't imagine what it would have been like for my mom as well, like leaving her social networks as well. It is about having that resilience. And I want to take a moment to really define resilience and what I mean by resilience, and when resilience is called on and when it is not. So resilience is defined as the ability to recover from or adjust easily to misfortune or change. This actually came from literature from the 1970s, where they're studying populations of kids, inner city kids in New York, that came from very impoverished backgrounds. Scientists were studying them and understanding like what were the factors, like how these kids would turn out, for lack of a better word, and noticing that some of the kids actually did very well. They flourished. So they started to identify factors that confer resilience to individuals psychologically. And so I want to emphasize that this is, when I'm talking about how to boost resilience and what's important for resilience, I'm talking about our ability to cope with mild to moderate controllable stressors. I'm not talking about severe experiences of trauma. I take a lot of my work from this, working with in allyship with people that are members of equity deserving groups. So for example, the Black communities, Indigenous communities, folks that have disabilities, so our neurodiverse communities. I work very closely with folks with substance use disorders, so that's where my allyship is really shaped. And I want to call your attention to a great podcast called Don't Call Me Resilient. It's by a Black woman, a Black female, who really, really abhors the use of the term resilient. And I took this quote, it's not from her, but it very much exemplifies her perspective. I dream of never being called resilient again in my life. I'm exhausted by strength. I want support. I want softness. I want ease. I want to be amongst kin, not patted on the back for how well I take a hit or for how many. This is not, so when we talk about experiences of racism, discrimination, that is not what I'm talking about when I'm talking about mild to moderate controllable stressors. Resilience is not what's called for in those situations. Social justice is. So I want to put that caveat in everybody's mind, that when I'm talking about boosting resilience and how this is crucial for our experience of navigating life and stress, I want to recognize that there are boundaries to this, that resilience should be called for only in very specific circumstances and not in these very extreme situations. So with that in mind, I want to argue that being challenged builds resilience. And I want to call on us all to imagine those challenges as we are moving from continent to continent, from country to country, from school board to school board. These are challenges. They're not necessarily controllable, but they are moderate. They're not threatening our safety, right, necessarily. And that's what I always, when I give talks related to resiliency and how we should lean into challenges, I always want to remind folks, when we look at a spectrum of discomfort and unsafe, I'm talking about this discomfort space, right? We lean into the discomfort. We don't lean in necessarily, some jobs they do, right? You're deployed somewhere in a very threatening environment. That is leaning into something unsafe. That's a whole other conversation. But certainly leaning into something that is challenging, it's uncomfortable. It is absolutely uncomfortable. I think about that all the time when I'm teaching university students that are feeling uncomfortable in my classrooms, because sometimes they don't know what is she saying, like she's talking over my head, or uncomfortable meeting new people in a new environment. That's uncomfortable. It's not unsafe. And there is a good amount of literature, both from the psychological world and the neuroscience world, that shows that in fact, if you expose people and animals and organisms, so they've done this in animal models, to mild to moderate controllable stressors, this actually boosts the organism's ability to manage stress in the future. And this is what's called the stress inoculation theory. And this is it's like a cartoon curve that shows that if you are experiencing, low to moderate stress exposures, and if you've experienced it prior at sort of mild to moderate amounts of stress in the future, your performance, your behavior in response to those stressors is higher than somebody or an organism that has not experienced prior stress. And I want to emphasize that this is a concept that is conserved across taxonomy. If you mildly stress a plant, either by not giving enough sunlight or water or nutrients, the plant flourishes. Humans are the same, right? It's conserved across taxa. And I'm going to show you, like I said, I've got this really cool data from the neuroscience world showing exactly this, that showing that when organisms are provided the opportunity to experience stress, and in the case of this, it's exercise, it actually boosts the brain's ability to make it more resilient to stress in the future. So how do they do this? They had, in this case, it was an animal study. They had 2 groups of mice. If you ever had a rodent as a pet, you get them the running wheel, and they love running on that running wheel. We do this in the lab. So we had 2 groups where we had one group that had access to this running wheel and one group that did not, that was considered the sedentary or control group, and they were allowed to have this running wheel access for 6 weeks. And then all of the animals from each group was exposed to this mild to moderate stressor, which was 5 minutes of cold water stress. So you put an animal, the mouse, in a tank of cold water, and rodents are very good at swimming, so we obviously make sure that they don't drown, but they're okay at swimming in this cold water. So it's the cold that is stressful. And then what they did was they decapitated the animals, so they sacrificed them. They took out their brain, and what they did was look at the birth of new neurons in the brain. So this is known as neurogenesis. So essentially, all throughout the lifespan, your brain is birthing new cells. I don't know if anybody knows this. This is actually something that was only discovered in the last 50 years. Scientists don't really know what's the purpose of these newly born cells, but they do know that there's an association between the rate of these newly born cells, or the rate of neurogenesis, how often you're pumping out these new cells, and cognitive and mental health. So animals that have high rates of neurogenesis, and then you put them in tests that look at depression and anxiety, they do better than animals that have low rates of neurogenesis. So it's this marker of brain health, let's put it that way. So in this study, what they did was they decapitated the animals. They looked at a region of the brain known as the hippocampus, which is involved in anxiety regulation, and they wanted to see how many, what's the rate of neurogenesis between these animals that were runners versus sedentary. And again, you don't need to be a neuroscientist to see this massive increase when you're counting the cells that are newly born. You can see the running animals had significantly higher rates of neurogenesis compared to the sedentary animals. Panel B is just showing each of these animals is pointing at a cell that is labeled as a new cell, and you can see the running animals had much more cells. C and D, I'm just going to say it in words because it's a bit complex. But what they also looked at was the rate of immediate early genes. So that's a marker of, basically when that happens, it's like your brain saying, oh my goodness, raise the alarm, there's something I need to deal with, produce all these immediate early genes. And animals that were sedentary had this massive increase in immediate early genes. By contrast, animals that had the running wheel experience had greater activity in cells in the brain that calm down the anxiety. So greater activity in these inhibitory cells. So the bottom line is that in this case, running, so previous aerobic exercise, which is a stressor, improved anxiety regulation by engaging the brain in these inhibitory mechanisms, in particular in a part of the brain that is involved in anxiety regulation. So all that is to hit home that stress inoculation piece. When we engage in these mild to moderate, in some cases controllable, uncontrollable stressors, it boosts our ability, and we overcome them. We face them and we overcome them. It boosts our ability to face and overcome them in the future. So this brings me back to, the final messages today. Like, what does this mean for you as parents, for you as military families, for the health and well-being of yourselves and your children in the face of sometimes these mild to moderate controllable stressors. Sometimes they feel uncontrollable. How can you manage that space? And I would say, if anything, the messages from my talk today, I would say the 3 C's. Allow your child to lean into the challenge, acknowledge it, and face it. I would say always, like the best way to, if your child is upset, lean into the upset. If your child is expressing like that they are scared and worried, lean into it with them. Don't like try to shut down the emotions. The emotions are there for a reason, but also don't take away. And in your case, this doesn't necessarily happen, but we do see often in other contexts, as parents, when we see our children distressed and upset, we try to remove the thing that made them distressed or upset because we think that that's going to be the better thing for them. And I would argue in that context of stress resilience, that taking away the stressor is not a good idea. And of course, moving, you can't take away the stressor, but maybe you can apply this to other contexts. And then experiencing those consequences. I think it's really like good emotional savviness, is that a word? Awareness is about experiencing the consequences of what happens when you take those challenges. And sometimes they're negative and sometimes they're positive, and just experience that space, because that promotes good metacognition, right? This was hard today, right? This was a tough day. Yes, it was. Acknowledge that space with your child, or even within yourself. And then the 3rd C is really about the coping. How to really help your child navigate these transitions is about equipping them with the tools to do well. And that's, again, with those lifestyle factors. Are they sleeping well? Are they eating well? Are they moving their body? Are they developing friendship connections when possible? And now, I mean, back in my day, I feel super old. We didn't have FaceTime and social media, right? We had letters, right? So I did write letters to my old friends, but that was about it. But allowing that, boosting the coping, and sometimes that means talking to people, right? Therapy is okay. When you think about how that distress tolerance piece, and maybe you're seeing that in your children as well, this is the movement of radical acceptance, is about, again, leaning into that feeling and acknowledging that it's okay, and you'll get through it, right? So these are some statements that that I often say in myself, right? I say it to my kids. I can't change the situation, but I can control how I respond to it. I cannot stress over the things I can't change. This feeling will pass. I will be okay. I've dealt with this before, right? Like, I constantly say that to myself. I've been here before. I've gone through it. I can deal with it again. And then I love this graphic about sitting with discomfort. If you have your child or yourself that's really struggling in a space, recognize that, like I said, good self-awareness is like feeling it. It feels uncomfortable, right? I'm feeling that. I notice my resistance and feeling this discomfort. Okay. I can do this. I'm relaxing. I witness the sensations, etc. We have that, trying to numb it, right, with alcohol or substances, right? That's going to only lead to the feeling persisting. And then the last tip that I'm going to provide is, I like this, is the TIP skill, TIP. Remember what I said, that when you face stress, it boosts your ability to manage it in the future. And it doesn't matter what that stressor is. You're engaging in that same circuitry in your brain. So like tipping your face in very cold water and dealing with that, and like feeling it, like, oh, this is cold, like being aware of it, that is boosting that capability. Intense exercise does it. Paced breathing. So there's a lot of like mindfulness, meditative stuff. There's a lot of great research showing that all these breathing techniques, even like holding your breath for long periods of time, really does, again, do a lot for your nervous system, as well as your paired muscle relaxation. So you're thinking about your breathing at the same time as you're flexing and relaxing your muscles. So the last thing I want to emphasize, that as parents and as humans, as people that are navigating these difficult spaces, the best thing that you can do for somebody, and including your children, is to take care of yourself. So when I talk about how to cope with stress, it's not just boosting that ability in your children. It's about taking that to heart and doing the things for yourself. And sometimes that's overwhelming to look at everything. We can't like have 8 hours sleep and eat like macro diet and like have a 30-minute jog and like call a friend for support. That can't all happen in one day. And my advice to you is just pick one thing every day in support of your mental health, whether it is that good night's sleep, whether it is, a good healthy meal. If you're somebody that tends to eat fast food at lunch, taking that time to make yourself a really healthy meal, calling a friend when you need some support, or recognizing when you're engaging in coping that never seems to go anywhere. Really, it's all about our own mental well-being is a gift, right? And I want to just close by saying I didn't know it at the time that all these moves would build me into the strong, resilient human I am today. I acknowledge that my ability to make new friends at university as an undergraduate, leaning into just not knowing anybody and just being like, hey, I'm Kim, that came from all those moments in my life where I was thrown into a new environment. It has made me into an extremely empathic, kind, self-aware human that knows what it feels like not to belong. And so it nourishes and enriches my work in the space of equity, diversity, and inclusivity, and how I continue to create inclusive classrooms with my students and make sure that every student feels like they can belong in my classroom. That is informed by my lived experience as somebody that moved all over the world. And while it sucked hard at the time, I can now look back and I experience nothing but gratitude for the journeys that I've been on. And I really hope that your children as well will feel that and recognize some won't, and that's okay. We all have different personalities that are brewing in this mix as well. So thank you. I think I went over time. I can't see a clock, but thank you for staying much longer than my actual allotted time. And I'm happy to take questions in the chat or raise your hand. I can definitely stay on for longer if need be. And here's how to contact me. I'm Googleable. If you Google my name, it's me and a Belgian architect. That's not me.
That's awesome, Kim. Wonderful. If anybody has some questions, if you want to put them in the chat, or I don't see any hands up at the moment. Again, this is my first time doing it, but if anybody has any specific questions, I've got tons of ideas of future seminars and spin-offs from this. And if anybody has any thoughts as well, please feel free to share those with us. I'm just going to share my screen here. Jeremy, I think, is keeping an eye on the chat. So,
no worries. Thank you, Ashley and Karen. Appreciate. Yeah, hopefully this resonates. Brittany, thank you, Marie. Merci.
We do want to mention just quickly, some important reminder of resources that families can access as members of the CAF, both for you and for your children, seeking support in those times that are particularly difficult and hardest to cope with. So you do have access to the family information line, and there's also access for CAF Kids to Kids Help Phone, and there's a texting service that CAF Kids can access. So for older children, this is also a great resource. So if you are looking for extra resources and support, please check in on the CFMWS website. The links are there, and I think maybe Jeremy was going to pop them into the chat for folks as well. Can't see the chat at the moment. Anything
And
else?
a lot of wonderful thanks and appreciation messages.
Wonderful.
Well, all good. Sometimes I
Excellent.
just I've answered all the questions. Sometimes, right? That's so there's a lot to digest. And I know sometimes on these virtual spaces it can be difficult to kind of speak up, but no worries. Appreciate the opportunity to chat with you all.
So if there's no specific questions at this moment, I want to take the time to thank everybody for attending, and in particular thank Kim for joining us. This is the second time I've gotten to hear you speak, and it was as awesome as the first time. And as a fellow science geek, I really appreciate that side of it. The understanding of the minutia, I think, is key to help inform some of our behaviors. So I definitely really appreciate it, and I hope the people with us tonight did as well. And like I say, I have a whole list of possible follow-up seminars that we could hopefully launch. That was brilliant, and I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you again for the invitation. I've just put the link to my podcast in case people are thirsty for more science. It's actually a mix of neuroscience, cognitive science, and psychology called Minding the Brain. And I also have a lot of freely available animations on YouTube. Heather's saying it's hard
Excellent.
to know when it goes from mild, moderate to bad, especially in a busy military life. Yeah, for sure. That's like usually when I get asked questions is like, how do I know that, when do I lean into the challenge and not, right? Because like I had a parent once say, like, a kid who's like afraid to go for a sleepover, right? It's not unsafe. It's challenging, right? To, and when do you push your kid, and when do you acknowledge that they're listening to their body and they want to stop? And I would say that's the navigating murky waters of sometimes we don't know, right? And that's okay. And I would just always say open conversation with your child, being mindful of patterns, right? Because what is hard to see is a pattern of avoiding certain situations that then become increasingly difficult to get out of. So if a child doesn't want to go for a sleepover because they're nervous and scared, and that you're trying to coach them through that and they're still like resistant, okay, fine, you got to honor that. But then if it's a continual pattern, then that's when it becomes a bit trickier, and it is hard. There's no easy recipe of what that feels like. And I would say that's why it's really good. The word I was thinking of, it's not resonating in my head right now, but like when we know our feelings, like we've done so much in our society to like numb feelings, or like don't cry, don't feel your emotions, that then it becomes very difficult to pay attention to that. So the work in paying attention to the emotions and naming them and labeling them is so vital for navigating when you are in that spectrum of I feel really, really scared, unhappy, etc.
Awesome. Anything else? Last questions? Great. Again, thank you so much, Kim. We really appreciate it, and look forward to next time.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for inviting me, and
Awesome.
thanks for joining me tonight, everybody. Take care.